region, specifically the catastrophic situation unfolding around the besieged city of El Fasher.
Yeah, and we're looking at reports from, the UN, Human Rights Watch, the SciHa Network, and they paint a really harrowing picture: mass killings, systemic forced displacement, targeted violence against ethnic groups, and severe gender-based abuses, mass rape, sexual slavery. It's grim.
It is. And the warnings are stark. They suggest these patterns echo, historical violence in Darfur, and they're approaching the threshold of crimes against humanity, maybe even genocide.
And what's equally stark, despite all this documentation, all this evidence, is what's been acknowledged as a strikingly weak international response. I mean, the world has essentially watched this tragedy unfold.
Precisely. And that striking weakness, that's the heart of our disagreement today. We need to ask, what is the primary driver of this near total failure to deploy what the reports call meaningful protection or intervention? Now, I hold that the failure is largely a function of immediate external distraction. Global attention, frankly, has been consumed by other crises, and that's allowed the tragedy in Darfur to unfold in darkness. I'll argue this fading attention is the most proximate and critical cause. It translates directly into impunity for the warring parties, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Sudanese armed forces.
See, I come at it from a completely different perspective. I believe the cause runs much deeper than, just headlines or the news cycle. I'm going to argue that this failure reflects a systemic and, frankly, disturbing hierarchy of whose lives and rights are prioritized. The persistent lack of decisive action, even with genocide warnings on the table, proves to me that intervention wasn't ever structurally really possible, because the lives affected were already, in a sense, structurally devalued.
Okay, let me lay out my core thesis then. It focuses on that immediate operational vacuum. The near total impunity that the perpetrators are enjoying right now, it's a direct consequence of Sudan having simply, faded from the global consciousness. This weakness is an issue of urgency displacement. The tragedy continues because the necessary external pressure, the public and political focus that generates that urgent pressure on decision makers, it's just absent. And without that sustained visibility, the machinery of international aid, sanctions enforcement, it just grinds to a halt. So distraction, I argue, is the critical mechanism that allows those structural failures you might point to operate at their deadliest, leaving millions vulnerable to a tragedy that is, I believe, actually preventable.
I acknowledge that media attention can be a catalyst, sure. But the problem isn't just temporary distraction. It's the structural prioritization calculus. Look, the root cause, as I see it, is a systemic bias that dictates which crises warrant high-cost intervention. We know the international bodies, the UN, Security Council, the African Union, they've managed to issue statements and called for restraint, right? So that confirms a basic awareness exists. Now, if the issue were merely an attention economy problem, those initial warnings, documenting mass killings, the start of targeted ethnic violence, that should have been enough, shouldn't it? Enough to trigger decisive protective action, not just, vague rhetoric? The persistent failure to move beyond statements, even when confronted with evidence of specific, calculated, gender-based atrocities documented by the SIHA network, that shows me the required political will was structurally absent from the very beginning.
Well, while I'd concede that a pre-existing hierarchy influences where a crisis sort of lands on the priority list initially, the source material itself explicitly links the current inertia, the current inaction, to the absence of sustained political visibility. The reports state quite plainly that the failure stems from global attention consumed by other crises. Think about the operational reality for a moment. If a war is dominating global headlines, humanitarian access gets prioritized, sanctions are actually enforced, peacekeeping forces are seriously discussed. When the attention shifts elsewhere, impunity blooms. This state of affairs where medical facilities are attacked, aid convoys are deliberately halted, this is directly enabled by the darkness created when the global focus is elsewhere. So distraction becomes the mechanism of greatest and most proximate consequence.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the operational failure is solely dictated by the news cycle. Let me explain why. If the issue were purely attention-based, those initial warnings from the UN and HRW, the ones documenting the sheer scale of displacement, the beginnings of this catastrophe. They should have been sufficient, right? Sufficient to trigger immediate, robust action, not just these symbolic statements we saw. The fact that the international community failed to mobilize resources or deploy meaningful protection, even at the outset, when there was some initial attention, demonstrates that the political will was structurally absent long before the headlines completely faded. This, to me, suggests the hierarchy holds precedence over attention cycles. The international community knew, but it seems they consciously failed to deploy resources commensurate with the threat, which points to a deep, systemic devaluation of the lives affected in Darfur.
That line of reasoning, though, I think it minimizes the reality of resource fatigue in global crisis management. Priority, it's a finite political and financial resource. If a catastrophic event erupts elsewhere that demands massive funding and diplomatic bandwidth, and we've certainly seen that happen recently, that inevitably pulls resources away from crises like Darfur that require sustained, grinding attention. The mechanism of the failure, I'd argue, is the resource diversion caused by competing immediate crises. Yes, the structural hierarchy might determine who gets the last slice of the pie, so to speak, but it's the global consumption of attention that makes the pie so small in the first place for places like Darfur.
That's a compelling point about finite resources. But let's consider the nature of the documentation we're talking about ignoring here. This isn't just abstract instability. We are talking about specific, detailed evidence of severe abuses against women and girls, rape, sexual slavery, torture, and the explicit targeting of the Masalit ethnic group, which analysts warn approaches genocide. Now, in the context of international law, humanitarian principles, this type of evidence, particularly specific gender-based atrocities, is historically supposed to trigger an immediate, high-priority protection response. The continued silence, specifically in the face of this kind of evidence, seems to reinforce the idea of a disturbing political calculus, one that dictates that these specific victims in Darfur simply do not cross the threshold for meaningful, costly intervention.
Okay, I see why you emphasize the content of the atrocities, and the severity it's undeniable. But even the worst abuses require sustained external pressure to force a reaction from sovereign states and, frankly, from international bodies. The documentation we're both relying on confirms that attacks on civilians are rampant, and crucially, humanitarian access is systematically denied. This denial, this is the immediate life-saving failure point. Attacking medical facilities, halting humanitarian convoys, this has left hundreds of thousands without access to food, medicine, or safe passage. And this chaos, it's directly enabled by the impunity created when the global focus is elsewhere. If headlines were dominating the diplomatic pressure, the sanction pressure, it would be overwhelming. It would force belligerents to respect civilian life and humanitarian access. So the structural failures you describe, they are rendered most deadly by the absence of urgency that sustained attention provides.
But this brings us right back to the inherent flaw in the system, doesn't it? We're back to this idea that action requires urgent pressure on decision makers. The question remains, why is that pressure necessary at all when UN investigations and major NGOs have already documented violence that meets the criteria for international crimes? I mean, if a just, non-hierarchical system existed, wouldn't documented mass murder and ethnic targeting intrinsically create the necessary urgency, regardless of competing headlines in other regions? The very fact that the system requires external, often transient, manufactured pressure to react to mass violence implies that Darfur was already structurally marginalized. Frankly, that prioritization calculus, which weighs things like geopolitical proximity, economic interest, perhaps ethnic connection, it seems to supersede the severity of the humanitarian crisis itself.
That's an interesting point, and I would agree that the very necessity of pressure is itself an indictment of the structural reality. But let's frame it slightly differently. When global attention is consumed elsewhere, it directly affects the leverage available to those trying to impose that pressure. When the spotlight shifts away, funding gets cut, sanctions become harder to enforce, diplomats lose their mandate for proactive intervention. The structural hierarchy might determine who gets overlooked when resources are scarce, but the shifting attention is the operational lever that actually executes the overlooking. The consumption of attention is the direct trigger for the observable weakness that we're critiquing here.
Look, if the hierarchy were merely waiting for attention to be diverted, why didn't the key players, let's say the Security Council nations with veto power, use the initial surge of attention back in late 2023 to enact real protective measures or deploy deterrent forces? The absence of perhaps significant geopolitical interest or economic stakes in the region meant the cost-benefit analysis simply didn't favor intervention. That entrenched structural bias, that prioritization calculus, that is the reason why Darfur fades so easily from view. And it's why even if attention returned tomorrow, the result might still just be more strongly worded statements, not, boots on the ground or genuine humanitarian protection.
So, to summarize my perspective, the failure we're seeing right now is defined by the massive weakness resulting from global attention being diverted. While structural issues undoubtedly contribute to Darfur's vulnerability, without the external pressure sustained by that attention, millions of Sudanese civilians remain exposed and the crisis is allowed to continue unfolding in darkness. Distraction is the critical, observable, and frankly, the remediable failure point right now.
And I remain unconvinced by that line of reasoning. For me, the consistent failure to move beyond rhetoric to concrete protection, even with this mounting documentation of severe gender and ethnic abuses that traditionally prompt a response, it points to a deeper, more disturbing structural hierarchy, one that dictates priority, regardless of the ebb and flow of headlines. The international system, in this instance, appears to have been calibrated for sophisticated inaction. Regardless of whether attention is the ultimate cause or merely the amplifier of a structural bias, the documentation reveals a preventable human catastrophe unfolding right now. Leaving the listener, I suppose, to consider how international systems really determine whose rights are prioritized on the world stage when confronting crimes against humanity in real time.